You came in August as a reformer, and there have been a lot of high hopes for your success. Can you just tell me in general, how's it going so far?
I would say it's going reasonably well. Uh, Obviously, I'm not the only person who came in on a mandate to reform and change. There's quite a few of us. And obviously, it's backed up very much by the president and the vice president themselves. Happy to report that we're easily on track to be the most reformist government Indonesia has seen in 10, possibly 15 years. Having said that, our to-do list is very long. Um, the commodities boom has really caused us to neglect many of our infrastructure and institutions, and therefore our laundry list is very long. So even though the government, President Jokowi himself kicked off a massive deregulation and reform drive in September of last year, and even though since then we've issued 10 policy packages, to borrow the president's own words, we still have a long way to go. So by my own reckoning, we might be 3 to 5% into it. Having said that, I think we're pleasantly surprised that the public is generally supportive. And even some of the more potentially controversial reforms, like opening up more sectors to foreign investment, have not really triggered any kind of a backlash.
So, doing very well so far, but a long way to go, right?
Yeah, doing reasonably well,
Okay.
I would say, and a long way to go, yes.
Okay, okay. I was wondering, how are you mobilizing support in the cabinet to bring out reforms? Obviously, it's
Right.
very difficult to reform certain segments. So, how are you mobilizing support?
Well, I think one of President Jokowi's and Vice President Kala's great gifts is their gift of communication. Um, and they like to point to concrete stories, right? Obviously, this will not be the first time that we've gone through a wave of economic reforms. And we can point to many previous examples of reform that have proven very successful. And uh, I think what people forget is that uh, the fruits of reform can happen very quickly, actually. A mere 2 or 3 years after you implement reforms, you already begin to see results. Um, so they like to use concrete examples. For example, certain sectors used to be, oligopolistic or even monopolistic. Uh, one example the president likes to use is gas stations. Right, gas stations used to be a monopoly operated by our state-owned oil and gas company. And then in the early 2000s, the government opened it up to more entrants from the private sector. So Shell came in, Total came in, Petronas came in, and it forced the monopoly to up their game, right? To renovate their gas stations, to improve service, and so on. And 5 to 7 years later, their gas stations are transformed, and it's a much better service, better product across the industry. Same with airlines, same with banks. In the last 10 to 15 years, last 20 years, there's so many concrete examples of how reforms benefit not only the consumer, but in the end, even the industrial operators as well.
So, what you're saying is that the fruits of reform can happen very quickly under the right conditions.
I think it's funny. I would argue that there's never a good time for economic reform. There's always a tendency to want to delay or water them down. You know, Reform brings change, and it does shove people out of their comfort zone. So it's always uncomfortable, right? Having said that, uh, definitely it's easier to push reforms through during downturns. It's much harder to make the case to push through reforms when times are flush, right? When you're in an upswing. So from that perspective, I think the timing right now is pretty good.
Okay, good. If I could get on to the U.S. elections, actually. Um, some candidates might not be fans of TPP, for example. Um, what are your thoughts on how, some of those candidates, if elected, might impact global trade in general?
Well, I think I was somewhat dismayed recently to read that, in fact, both in the USA and even in Europe, majorities of the public are very skeptical about free trade. And secondly, I believe that there are significant segments of society in the West, or for lack of a better word, the rich world, that feel left behind, right? That they haven't participated fairly in the benefits of global trade, global capitalism. I think we policymakers and political leaders and advocates of free trade have to do a better job of advocating it, of explaining with very concrete examples how everybody's benefiting, right? At a panel in Davos, I joked that really they should teach trade in junior high school. I read recently a very funny comment, maybe on Facebook or something. We teach our kids what's on the inside of living cells, but they have no idea where their sports shoe or their iPhone comes from, right?
Right.
I mean, if you're a user of an iPhone or an Android phone, or if you wear any of the popular sneaker brands, you're a beneficiary of global trade. But I think we haven't done a good job of explaining that to the public.
Do you think that going forward that would be something you would think about doing, especially with the U.S. market, find ways to explain to people?
Well, it's certainly something that we want to do in Indonesia, and hopefully within Southeast Asia, the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. We ourselves, having thought deeply and long and hard about it, are now newly energized by the concept of ASEAN, economic integration, trade integration among the 10-member Southeast Asian bloc. So, there are such things as scale economies, even in global trade or in global affairs. So, why would you want to face the rest of the world as even 250 million people if you could face it together as 630 million people, for example? So definitely, I think we want to and need to illustrate in very simple, concrete terms to our constituents, to our stakeholders, exactly in what way they're going to benefit from trade, from freer trade, and from economic integration.